She would like to make an announcement, Diane Okafor said into the microphone, smiling at the 200 guests seated in the grand dining room of the Fairview Club, about the man she's chosen to spend the rest of her life with. She paused for effect, champagne flute raised, eyes moving deliberately across the room until they found the one face she wanted. And I'd like everyone here to congratulate us. Daniel and I are engaged. The room did not erupt. It shifted. 200 people, in black tie, on a Thursday evening in October, gathered for the annual dinner of the Ashworth Family Foundation, shifted the way room shifted when something happened that couldn't be unhappened. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. Forks went still. A woman at the table nearest the stage made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite silence, but somewhere between the two. At the center table, beneath the chandelier that her late grandmother had donated to this room. 40 years ago, Marguerite Ashworth set down her water glass with the particular care of a woman deciding, in real time, how the next 10 seconds of her life would go. She did not look at Daniel. She didn't need to. She'd had 6 weeks. Before we go any further, if you've ever been in a room where someone tried to take something from you in public, believing you wouldn't fight back, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to know where this story is reaching. And if you're not subscribed to Ivory Secrets yet, now is the time, because this one is just getting started. Marguerite Ashworth had known about Diane Okafor for 43 days before that dinner. She had not found out the way women in films found out, tearful confessions, lipstick on collars, dramatic confrontations in hotel lobbies. She had found out the way she found out most things in her life, by paying attention when everyone around her assumed she wasn't. It was a Tuesday. She had come home from a site visit at the new community center her foundation was funding in the distillery district. Ahead of schedule, which was unusual, and which she had noted with the quiet satisfaction of someone who tracked these things. Daniel's car was in the drive. His assistant had told her he had a lunch that would run late. The car suggested otherwise. She had walked into the kitchen and found him finishing a phone call on the back terrace. She had not heard the words. She had heard the laugh. Not his public laugh, the one he used at fundraisers and board dinners, the one that was warm and a little too polished. This was different, lighter, almost unfamiliar. The laugh of a man who had somewhere to be that he preferred to the room he was standing in. He had come inside a moment later, phone already pocketed, face already arranged. "You're back early." The contractor was efficient. She had set her bag on the counter. She had looked at him with expression she wore when she was reviewing a grant proposal she already knew the answer to. He had kissed her cheek. "Good day," she said. And she had gone upstairs to change, and she had thought about the laugh, and she had begun, quietly and without drama, to pay attention. Marguerite Ashworth was 51 years old. She had run the Ashworth Family Foundation for 19 years, since her father's health had made it necessary, and her competence had made it inevitable. She was not a woman who mistook intuition for evidence, but she was also not a woman who dismissed one in the absence of the other. She noticed things. She cataloged them. She said nothing until she was certain, and then what she said was usually sufficient. Over the following 6 weeks, she had become certain. The changed password on his laptop, the twice-weekly client dinners that appeared on his calendar with no client name attached, the way he had started carrying his phone in his jacket pocket instead of leaving it on the kitchen counter, the way he had, for 7 years, small things, the kind of small things that accumulated into a shape a precise mind could not ignore. She had called her brother Christopher on a Wednesday evening in late September. Christopher was 48, a corporate lawyer with the kind of methodical intelligence that made opposing counsel genuinely uncomfortable. He had picked up on the first ring. "I need you to look at something," she said. "What kind of something?" "The foundation's financial agreements with Daniel's firm. Specifically, the clauses around the Ridgeway Capital Partnership." A pause. "Marguerite, I'm not asking you to do anything yet. I'm asking you to look." He had been quiet for a moment. "How long have you known?" "I'm not certain of anything yet. How long have you suspected?" She had looked at the city from her study window, the lake flat and gray in the October evening. 6 weeks. Another pause. I'll have the documents reviewed by Friday. Thank you. You're going to the foundation dinner next month. Yes. He's been confirmed on the guest list. I know. Christopher had exhaled slowly through his nose. And the Okafor group has a table. Hayes Ridgway is sponsoring their attendance. She had not known that. She had filed it precisely where it belonged, in the section of her mind where she kept things that were not yet relevant and would be shortly. I know, she said, because it was simpler. Marguerite, do you want me to? Not yet, she said. I'll know when. The night of the Ashworth Foundation annual dinner arrived, the way significant evenings arrived, in her life, quietly prepared for, externally unremarkable. Internally charged with the particular tension of a woman who had finished making a decision, and was now simply waiting for the moment to execute it. She had dressed at 6. Navy wool crepe, her grandmother's pearl earrings, the shoes she wore when she needed to be on her feet for 4 hours, and still look like she had chosen them for aesthetics. Her assistant, Priscilla, had confirmed the table arrangements that afternoon, confirmed the catering timeline, confirmed the slide deck for the Foundation's annual impact report, which Marguerite would present at 9 o'clock. She had also confirmed, without being asked, that Diane Okafor was seated at table 11, that Daniel was at table 4, with the Ridgway Capital delegation, that the 2 tables had an unobstructed sight line to the stage. Marguerite had noted this and said nothing. The Fairview Club's grand dining room held 200 people comfortably, and another 20, with the kind of strategic table compression that only very good event coordinators could execute without the room noticing. The Foundation had used the same coordinator for 11 years. The room was arranged perfectly. Ivory linens, low centerpieces of white garden roses, candlelight, warm enough to be flattering, and bright enough that people could read the menu. A room designed to make its occupants feel both significant and comfortable. Marguerite moved through the cocktail hour, with the ease of a woman who had been doing this since she was 19 years old, and brought to Foundation events by her father to learn what the work actually looked like in practice. She knew everyone. She knew the names of their children. She knew which board member's daughter had just gotten into medical school and which philanthropist was quietly considering a major bequest and needed 6 more months of cultivation before the ask. She was present, she was warm, and she was watching everything. Daniel arrived at 7:40 with the Ridgway Capital Group, 4 men and a woman in conference, polished business, formal, the kind of group that arrived slightly too loud, and then recalibrated when they read the room. He found her near the bar. He kissed her cheek, said something about the room looking wonderful, asked if she needed anything. His eyes, she noticed, moved to table 11, and then back to her face in the space of a single sentence. I'm fine, she said. Go connect with your colleagues. He smiled the smile she had once found genuinely charming, and moved away. She turned back to the conversation she had been having with a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, the Foundation's medical advisory chair, who had been watching the exchange with the careful attention of someone who understood more than she was being told. You look very calm, Patricia said quietly. I always look calm at these events, Marguerite said. You look differently calm than usual. Patricia reached for her wine. You're going to have to tell me. Eventually, you know? Eventually, Marguerite agreed, and the dinner bell rang. The evening moved the way these evenings moved. Dinner service, conversation, the particular social choreography of a room full of people who were there to be seen doing something good, and who were in fact also doing something good, which was a more complex dynamic than it appeared. Marguerite sat at the head table and managed it, all with the practiced ease of 19 years. Her attention divided equally between the guests to her left, the serving schedule, and the quiet ongoing awareness of where in the room. Daniel's eyes kept landing, table 11. He was not subtle about it, that was the thing. She had spent 6 weeks watching him become progressively less careful, the way people who were keeping a secret gradually mistook familiarity with it for safety. He had started by being meticulous and ended by being reckless, and she had recognized the shift the moment it began, because she had been watching for exactly that. The impact presentation ran from 8:45 to 9:15. She delivered it herself, the way she always did, standing at the podium without notes much because she knew every number and every story in the report by heart. She spoke about the community center in the distillery district, about the girls' education bursary program, now in its 7th year, about the new mental health partnership with 3 Toronto hospitals. She spoke clearly and with the particular warmth of someone who genuinely cared about what they were describing. The room listened. It always listened when Margaret Ashworth spoke about the Foundation's work, partly because she was good at it, and partly because this room understood that the Ashworth name meant something, had meant something, for 3 generations, and that the woman at the podium had spent her adult life making sure it continued to mean it. She returned to her seat. At 9:17, the dessert service began. The room relaxed into that end-of-evening quality, where conversations become more honest and more careless in equal measure. At 9:42, Daniel stood up, not from his chair, not quietly. He stood the way men stood when they wanted to be seen standing, pushing back from the table, clearing his throat, reaching for the nearest empty wine glass to tap it. 200 people looked at him, because that was what 200 people did when a man in a well-cut suit tapped a glass in a room like this one. He smiled. "I hope everyone will forgive the interruption," he said, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his professional life doubted that his interruptions were welcome. "I just want to say this foundation does remarkable work." He paused. "And the people in this room who make that work possible deserve to be acknowledged." Another pause. His eyes moved briefly and unmistakably toward table 11, especially the people who have the courage to show up and claim the things they actually want, regardless of a half-beat, almost nothing, almost deniable, previous arrangements. He raised his glass. The room did not quite know what to do with that. There was a smattering of polite acknowledgement, the kind that happened when an audience wasn't sure what they were applauding, but felt socially obligated to respond. A few glasses lifted. Most did not. Patricia, seated 2 chairs down from Marguerite, had gone very still. Marguerite had not moved. And then from table 11, a chair scraped back. Diane Okafor was 34 years old. She was wearing a dress the color of champagne, which had possibly seemed like a good choice earlier in the evening, and which, under the current circumstances, had taken on a quality that several people in the room would remember and describe to others in the weeks ahead. She was holding her own glass. She was smiling with the particular brightness of a woman who had decided tonight was the night, and was not yet close enough to the edges of that decision to see what was past them. "I'd like to add something," she said, and her voice carried beautifully, because she had clearly thought about this moment, had rehearsed the voice, had positioned herself at a table with good acoustics. "To the courage it takes to choose honestly, even when the easier choice is to stay comfortable." She let that settle. She looked, deliberate and direct, at Daniel. "And to the people who make that choice possible." She raised her glass higher to new beginnings, "and to the people who deserve them." She looked then at Marguerite Ashworth. The look was a declaration. It was meant to be one. Diane held it for 4 full seconds, the smile high and bright and certain, and she drank. 200 people, in a room designed for significance, witnessed what followed in a silence so complete. It had its own particular texture. Nobody else raised a glass. Nobody echoed the toast. The room's collective attention moved, with the involuntary precision of 200 people processing the same information simultaneously, to the woman at the head table, who had just been publicly addressed, and who had not moved, had not blinked, had not altered by any measurable degree the expression on her face. Marguerite Ashworth looked at Diane Okafor for a long, unhurried moment. Then she folded her hands on the table in front of her. Then she looked at her watch. Then she reached for her water glass and drank from it, with the unhurried calm of a woman who had just checked something off, a list she had been maintaining for 6 weeks, and could now move to the next item. She did not look at Daniel. Diane's smile held for 5 seconds. Then something crossed her face, not understanding, not yet, but its precursor, the first faint awareness that the room had not responded the way she had expected it to respond, and then the dining room doors opened. What the room understood in the first 3 seconds was not the specific information. They would piece that together in the days and weeks that followed, in calls and lunches, and the particular social archaeology of a community that paid attention. What they understood immediately, instinctively, was weight. The specific gravitational weight of arriving with the settled certainty of people who had decided exactly what they were doing and had no intention of being hurried about it. Reginald Ashworth was 74 years old, and he had not attended the Foundation's annual dinner in 6 years, since his health had made extended evenings difficult. He was wearing the gray suit he reserved for things that mattered. He walked with a cane now, but he walked with it the way he did everything. Without apology. Without concession to the fact that the cane was new. With the complete ease of a man who had spent 50 years being the most purposeful person in any room he entered. Beside him, Christopher Ashworth moved with the particular controlled energy of a man who had spent the last 6 weeks doing something quiet and thorough, and was now in the room where the result of it would land. He was 48, and he had his father's eyes and his mother's precision and the expression of someone who had already run through every contingency and was satisfied with the preparation. Behind them, 2 people who several guests immediately recognized. Suzanne Marchetti, the Foundation's legal counsel, and beside her, a man named Roland Osnew as the managing director of Clearwater Institutional Capital, which held the largest single investment position in Ridgeway Capital's operating fund. Daniel saw them from across the room. Marguerite did not watch his face change. She didn't need to. She could feel it, the way you could feel a shift in pressure before a storm, the specific of man understanding something he had been not understanding for a very long time. Reginald moved through the parting room toward his daughter. The room made space for him the way rooms made space for things that were going to happen regardless, not out of obligation, but out of the simple physics of inevitability. He reached her table. He looked at her with the particular attention of a father who had, over the course of a long life, learned to read his daughter's face for the things she would never say. "We're here," he said. "Right on time," she said. He took her hand briefly, the way he had taken her hand at her grandfather's funeral and at her mother's, at the moments when the Ashworth family's response to difficulty was to stand very close together and say very little and mean everything. Then he straightened and turned and looked across the room at Daniel Hayes with the expression of a man assessing a problem he had already solved. Daniel had not stood up. He was sitting at table 4 with his wine glass in his hand, and his face the color of old plaster, and the expression of a man who was running a very fast cap at answers he did not want. He had thought he was leaving a marriage. He had not understood that the marriage existed inside a structure, and that the structure did not belong to him. Christopher crossed the room with the efficient unhurtedness of a man for whom courtrooms had been ordinary for 20 years, and who found, as a result, that no other room presented any particular challenge. He stopped 6 feet from Daniel's table. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. "Daniel." His tone was the tone of a man confirming information rather than introducing it. "I'm glad you're here tonight. There are some matters we should address." "Not tonight. Tonight is the Foundation's evening." He let a breath pass. "But soon. My office has already been in touch with Ridgeway's board counsel. I'd suggest your team receive that communication before business hours Monday." Daniel's jaw moved. "Christopher, this is not the—" "I agree," Christopher said pleasantly. "It isn't. Which is why I'm suggesting we handle it properly, on Monday rather than here." He let another pause land, the kind that wasn't dramatic, but that carried its full weight regardless. "Roland is here as well. I imagine he'll want a word at some point this evening." He glanced once toward Roland Osey, who was standing near the entrance with the composed watchfulness of a man who was already calculating. Then Christopher looked back at Daniel. "My father would like to speak with Marguerite privately. If you'll excuse us." It was grammatically a request. It was not a request. At table 11, Diane Okafor had set her champagne glass down. It made a small click on the linen that, in the quiet that had descended over that section of the room, was audible to the 3 near its tables. She was sitting with a stillness that was the particular stillness of someone recalculating very quickly. She had prepared. For this evening for weeks, she had prepared for Victoria, for Marguerite, to react, to cry, possibly, to leave, to make a scene which would have been satisfying in one way or humiliating in another, but which would have been comprehensible, at least. A response she had a script for. She did not have a script for this. A woman she didn't know had sat at table 11 with the Okafor group, a colleague from the firm, who had come because the invitation was offered, and who was now finding that she had vastly underestimated the complexity of the evening. She shifted her chair, barely perceptibly, 4 inches to the left. Reginald Ashworth sat down in the empty chair, beside his daughter that had been, Marguerite noted, left empty all evening by Priscilla's arrangement, and said nothing for a moment. The room around them had begun very carefully to resume the ordinary sounds of an event still technically in progress. Dessert plates being cleared, quiet conversation, the orchestra in the corner picking up something soft and noncommittal. "He brought her to your foundation dinner," Reginald said, quietly, not with anger, in the tone of a man stating the final factor in a long equation. "He confirmed her attendance under the Ridgeway sponsorship block," Marguerite said. "He thought I wouldn't notice in advance, or that if I did, I wouldn't be able to respond in time." Reginald was quiet for a moment. "He didn't do his research," he said. "He researched the marriage," Marguerite said. "He didn't research the family." Her father looked at her then with the expression she had seen twice before in her life. Once when she had negotiated the foundation's first major federal partnership at 32, and once when she had managed a governance crisis that would have ended a lesser organization. Pride, unhurried and complete, from a man who was not given to performing it. "Christopher has the Ridgeway documents," she said. "The clause, Julian, that Christopher flagged is clear. The partnership agreement was contingent on Ashworth Capital's continued involvement in the operating structure. That's been in place since the beginning. Daniel never flagged it because he didn't believe it would ever be relevant. And Roland? Roland has already received the preliminary communication. His funds board meets Thursday." She picked up her water glass. "He won't be renewing the position." Reginald absorbed this. He looked at Daniel across the room. Briefly, with the detached assessment he had turned on many situations over the course of 50 years in business. Then he looked back at, "How are you?" he asked. Just that. She considered the question with the genuine attention it deserved. "I feel like someone who has been holding a door shut for 6 weeks and has finally been able to let go of the handle," she said. He nodded. He understood that. He had understood her for 51 years. At the far end of the room, his mother, Marguerite's mother, Eleanor Ashworth, who was 71 and who had not been announced when she entered, and who had spent the first 20 minutes after her arrival speaking quietly with Suzanne Marchetti near the coat check, and then simply standing and watching the room, with the unhurried attention of a woman who had attended events like this one for 40 years and knew exactly what was happening in them and why, moved now toward table 11. She walked without urgency. She did not look at Daniel. She was entirely focused on Diane Okafor, who saw her coming and went to, by visible degrees, very still. Eleanor Ashworth stopped beside the table. "I don't believe we've been introduced," she said. Her voice was even. It was the voice of a woman who had always occupied her own space without requiring permission. "I'm Eleanor Ashworth. Marguerite is my daughter." Diane looked up. I know who you are," Eleanor said, simply, without edge. "And I understand what you believed you were doing tonight." She paused. "Not for effect, or not only for effect, in the way of someone allowing a thought to find its accurate end before speaking it. You mistook the appearance of a space for the existence of one. That's understandable. Most people see what they're shown." She looked at Diane with a clarity that was not unkind. "But you were shown a marriage. You weren't shown the family behind it. Those are not the same thing." She let that settle. Then she turned and walked back to her husband's side with the same unhurried ease. And the entirety of her engagement with the woman who had stood up at the Ashworth Foundation's dining room and toasted the end of her daughter's marriage was complete. It was, several people would say in the days that followed, the most effective 40 seconds of the evening. The dessert service continued. The orchestra played. The event proceeded with the professional momentum of an occasion being kept on track by people who were very good at keeping occasions on track and who understood that the most respectful thing they could do for the room at this point was to give it something ordinary to do. Patricia appeared beside Marguerite at 9:58. She didn't say anything immediately. She sat in the chair Christopher had vacated. And she looked at her friend for a moment and then said, "Do you want to leave?" "Not yet," Marguerite said. "I want to present the bursary recipients. We announced them tonight, and they're in the room. And it would be—" She paused. "It matters to them. I'm not going to take that from the evening." Patricia looked at her. "All right, you can stop looking at me like I'm about to crack," Marguerite said. "I'm not. I know you're not," Patricia said. "I'm looking at you because I've known you for 14 years, and I've never seen you look like this." "Like what?" "Like someone who is completely finished with something and is genuinely okay with that." Marguerite reached for her coffee. "Is that what I look like? That's exactly what you look like." The bursary recipient announcement took 7 minutes. Marguerite returned to the podium and spoke about 4 young women from across Ontario who had received the Foundation's education bursaries that year, spoke about their fields of study and their plans, spoke with the particular warmth of someone for whom this was the actual point of the evening. The room listened with the focused attention of an audience that needed something real to hold on to after a complicated 40 minutes. And this was real. This was the thing the Foundation existed to do. She returned to her table afterward and found her father already pulling on his jacket. "We'll walk out together," he said. "Give me 1 moment." She walked to Daniel's table. He looked up when she approached, and in his face was something she had not seen in a very long time. Not guilt. Not the performance of guilt, but the unmanaged, unfamiliar expression of a man who had just understood something at a level that went past his prepared defenses. She didn't sit down. She stood and she looked at him for a moment and she said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "Christopher, we'll be in touch Monday. I've asked him to keep it clean. I don't want it long. Marguerite?" "I know," she said. "I know everything you would want to say. I don't need to hear it tonight." He held her gaze. "I'm sorry," he said. And the terrible, specific thing about it was that she believed him. She believed he was sorry when the full cost of a decision arrived and was larger than they had calculated. "I know," she said again. And she meant both things, that she believed him and that it no longer changed anything. She walked back to her father. She took his arm. Her mother fell into step on her other side, and Christopher joined them at the door. And the 4 of them walked out of the Ashworth Foundation annual dinner together with the unhurried certainty of a family that had done what it came to do. The Monday after the dinner, Daniel's assistant forwarded him 2 emails before 9 in the morning. The first was from Christopher Ashworth's office, with a subject line that was professionally worded and required no interpretation. The second was from the Clearwater Institutional Fund's managing director, confirming that the Funds Board had voted Thursday to request a full review of its Ridgeway Capital position, effective immediately. Daniel read both emails at his kitchen counter. He was alone. He had been alone since Friday, when Diane's calls had begun going to voicemail, not because he was avoiding them, but because he had looked at his phone on Friday afternoon and found, to his own genuine surprise, that he had nothing to say. He called Christopher's office at 9:15. The assistant who answered was professional and warm, in the specific way of legal assistants, who had been trained to convey information without interpretation. "Mr. Ashworth is available Tuesday at 2 o'clock, she said. "Or Thursday morning Tuesday," Daniel said. He sat at his kitchen table after he hung up. The apartment was very quiet. He had bought it 2 years ago as a pied-à-terre for late nights in the city, which it had been, and then as something else, which it had also been. It was a very good apartment. It had excellent light and a view of the lake, and he had told himself a variety of things about what it represented. He called Diane at 10. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "I saw the emails," she said before he spoke. "Diane, don't!" Her voice was controlled. "Just don't do the thing where you explain it." "I don't want the explanation." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "I handled this badly from the beginning." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You think? I should have. You should have been honest 18 months ago," she said. "Whatever you told yourself was going on between us, whatever version of this you decided was true, you should have been honest about what it was before you let it get to a foundation gala." A pause. "I made an idiot of myself in front of 200 people who all know her family. That wasn't. Don't tell me whose fault it was. I know whose fault it was. I also know my part in it." Her voice was steady, careful. The voice of someone choosing precision over emotion, because precision was the only thing available. "I need to go, Diane," but she was already gone. He sat with the dead phone and looked at a lake through his kitchen window and thought about the toast. About the way she had raised her glass with the complete, luminous confidence of a woman who believed she had already arrived at the place she was trying to get to. He thought about Marguerite's face when it happened, still, watchful, entirely unmoved, and about what it said about the distance between what Diane had understood about the situation and what had actually been true about it. He thought about Monday morning and the emails and the meetings his own team would be requesting explanations for by afternoon. He thought about the Ridgeway partnership, about the 3 years he had spent building the operating structure of a fund that, it turned out, been built partially on a foundation that required the Ashworths' continued goodwill to remain load-bearing. He had known this in the abstract. He had chosen in the quiet and incremental way that men chose things, without quite admitting they were choosing them, not to think about it too carefully. He thought about Tuesday at 2 o'clock. He called his own lawyer at 10:30. Marguerite spent Monday morning in her office at the foundation reviewing the bursary program's next cycle targets with her program director, a practical and energetic woman named Kezia, who had been with the foundation for 4 years and who had the specific gift of making large logistical problems look manageable. They worked through the morning with the focused efficiency of 2 people who genuinely liked the work. At noon, Priscilla knocked and came in. Christopher called. He said Tuesday is confirmed, and to tell you the preliminary response from Daniel's team is, she glanced at her notepad, cooperative and uncomplicated. His word. Good, Marguerite said. She turned back to the spreadsheet. Tell Christopher I'll call him this afternoon. Kezia, who had the particular ills of a good colleague, looked briefly at Marguerite and then back at her own documents and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. At 2 o'clock, Marguerite had a call with a woman named Dr. Adora Mensah, a research scientist at the University of Toronto, who had submitted a proposal to the Foundation 3 months ago about a longitudinal study tracking the professional trajectories of bursary recipients over 10 years. It was exactly the kind of initiative that made Marguerite feel, reliably and without sentimentality, that the work was worth doing. They spoke for an hour about methodology, about funding structures, about timelines, about what it meant to track the long-term impact of something you'd invested in before you knew what it would become. The honest answer, Adora said at one point, is that we won't know what we've built for 20 years. We just have to trust the foundation is solid and keep working. Marguerite thought about that after the call ended. She sat in her office with the afternoon light coming through the window and the lake visible in the distance, and she thought, yes, exactly. You build on what's solid. You work. You don't wait for the proof before you start. Diane Okafor called Gregory Halloran, a professional transition consultant, on the Tuesday after the dinner. She had found his name through a colleague who had described him as direct, which she needed more than anything at this point. He reviewed her CV with the unsentimental focus of a man for whom professional assessments were routine, and for whom pretending otherwise would have been a waste of both their time. Your instinct to stay quiet is correct, he said, after they'd gone through the situation with the specificity it required. The instinct to engage, to respond, to explain, to make yourself visible in relation to this story, that's the one to resist. For how long, until the story moves on, which it will. These things always do. He looked at her across the table. You have real skills. The CV is strong. This isn't a career ending. It's a course correction. But the correction has to happen in a different direction from where the noise is. She thought about Eleanor Ashworth's voice. You mistook the appearance of a space for the existence of one? She had thought about that sentence, and specifically about what it meant, on almost every day since Thursday. Different industry, she said. Different ecosystem, he said. Your project management skills transfer. The noise doesn't have to. She left his office into the cold October air and stood on the sidewalk and thought about the champagne toast and what had felt in the moment like certainty and what she now understood certainty actually required. Not confidence, not momentum, not the feeling of finally moving towards something. It required knowledge. It required understanding the full geography of what you were walking into. She had walked in understanding part of it. She understood the rest now. Across the city, the Tuesday meeting between Daniel and Christopher lasted 90 minutes and was, by any reasonable accounting, one of the more humbling, professional experiences of Daniel's adult life. Not because Christopher was unkind. He wasn't. He was precisely as professional as the situation required, and no more. But because there is a specific quality to being in a room with someone who has reviewed every document you signed in good faith and who can explain, calmly and without theatrical emphasis, exactly what those documents mean and exactly what options they leave available to you. The Ridgeway Partnership Agreement had been drafted 6 years ago. Christopher had drafted a portion of it himself as legal counsel for the Ashworth Foundation's involvement in the fund's structure. The relevant clause was unambiguous. You're not being closed out, Christopher said. The partnership is being restructured. The Ashworth capital position will be withdrawn according to the terms both parties agreed to at signing. Your remaining investors hold their positions independently, and Roland's fund is making its own determination on the basis of its own governance process. Daniel looked at him across the conference table, and the timeline. 90 days for the formal withdrawal. Your team can request a review period. We're not interested in causing unnecessary disruption to the fund's operating position. That's... Daniel stopped. He had been about to say generous, and had caught himself because the word implied that Christopher was doing him, and Christopher was not doing him a favor. So, Christopher was executing an agreement to its precise terms, no more and no less, and the fact that those terms had been written to allow for a clean, unwinding rather than an abrupt one was the result of care and foresight by people who had understood the structure completely from the beginning. I'd like to speak to Marguerite, he said. Christopher looked at him. That's for Marguerite to decide. She called him that evening, not because Christopher had asked her to, because 7 years, even 7 years that had ended the way these had ended, were worth a real conversation. I got your message, she said. Thank you for calling directly. He was in the apartment, looking at the lake. I wasn't sure you would. I thought about it, a pause. What do you want to say, Daniel? He had thought about this. He had rehearsed versions of it, constructed approaches, and then set them all aside because they all had the same problem. They were versions of a conversation with an audience. And she was not his audience. She was the person who had known him for 7 years, and who could tell the difference. I didn't understand what I was choosing, he said. I thought I was making one decision. I didn't understand the full scope of what that decision was inside of. You mean the partnership? I mean everything, he exhaled. The marriage, the family, what you've built. What I was, adjacent to for 7 years, in a way I understood as less than it was. A pause. I minimized it. Not deliberately, but I did. She was quiet for a moment. He thought about it honestly. I don't know, he said. I think I wanted something that felt simpler than my life. And I chose a way of getting it that was, he stopped. There was no good version of what I chose. No, she said. There wasn't. A silence, not uncomfortable. The silence of two people who had known each other long enough that silence was a form of conversation. What are you going to do? He asked. Keep working, she said, and he could hear in her voice something he hadn't heard in some time, the specific forward-facing quality of a person with somewhere to go that was entirely their own. Adora Mensah's research proposal is moving forward. We're expanding the bursary program by 30% next cycle. I have a board retreat in January and a keynote in March. The Ascend Summit? She paused. How did you? I saw the announcement in my inbox. Marguerite. He waited for her to say something. When she didn't, he said it. You'll be. A brief silence. I know, she said, not with arrogance, with the quiet ease of someone who had simply stopped waiting for permission to believe something true. Clean and fast, she said then. Christopher knows my terms. They're fair. I want it done before spring. Agreed, he said, without qualification. Good night, Daniel. He held the phone for a moment after the call ended. Then he set it down and sat with the lake and the city and the quiet and thought about what she had said. Keep working. That was it. That was the entire answer. Not a destination, not a resolution, not a trophy. Just work. Real work. On something real. That was hers. He thought about who he had been when he married her. The ambition. The genuine intelligence. The hunger to build something. He thought about when that man had started becoming something more managed, more performed, less present. Until the performance had become the thing itself and the person underneath it had been not lost but compressed, made smaller, accommodated to a life that looked impressive from the outside and had become, from the inside, increasingly hollow. He thought about Tuesday at 2:00 and Christopher's calm voice and the documents and what it had felt like to sit across from a man who understood every term of an agreement you had signed and who was now explaining, with perfect professional courtesy, what it meant. He thought about how long it had been since he had been in a room where someone knew more than him, and he had allowed himself to simply learn from it. He started writing at 11:00 that night. Not a proposal, not a pitch, just notes. The beginning of something he had been thinking about for 3 years, and setting aside because there was always a reason to set it aside, and the reason always looked like strategy and was probably, he understood now, closer to fear. He wrote for 2 hours, and when he stopped, the notes had a shape that interested him. He had somewhere to go. It was smaller than what he had had. It was more precisely his. That was, he thought, probably the direction. The divorce was finalized on a gray Wednesday in February. Christopher's office. Marguerite signed in the morning, her coat still on, her calendar full from noon onward. Julian. Christopher looked up from the document briefly and said simply, done. She looked at him. He looked at her. The Ashworth family's way with important moments was not to perform them, but to be present for them. And they were both present for this one. Thank you, she said. Always, he said. She took the elevator down and stepped out onto the street and stood in the February air and felt the cold on her face and thought, there it is, there's the bottom of it. Not the gala evening, not the toast, not the Monday emails. This. The clean, quiet, administrative end of a thing that had been ending for much longer. She called her mother. Eleanor. Picked up on the second ring. How do you feel? She looked up at the gray sky. Unencumbered, she said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. That's exactly right, she said. Come for dinner Sunday. I'll bring wine. She put her phone away and started walking toward the office. Kezia would have the bursary review documents ready. Adora's ethics board approval had come in. There was a call with the Hospital Foundation partnership at 3. There was so much work. Real work. She had been doing it for 19 years and she was still, she found, not finished being interested in it. She had never been finished being interested in it. That had been true before Daniel, and it was true after him, and it would be true in 20 years when the research study results came in and they looked at what the bursaries had become over a decade of being tended carefully and without fanfare. You don't wait for the proof before you start. You build on what's solid, and you work. The Ascend Summit keynote was in March on a Wednesday morning in a room of 350 women in finance, technology, and philanthropic leadership. Marguerite stood at the podium without notes and spoke for 38 minutes about the architecture of lasting institutions, about what distinguished the ones that lasted from the ones that didn't, about the specific discipline of building for the long term when the short term kept offering shortcuts, about what it meant to know the full geography of what you were walking into before you made your move. She did not mention Daniel. She did not mention the dinner. She did not need to. The room understood. Rooms like this one always understood. When she finished, the stillness lasted 2 full seconds. Then 350 people stood up. not because the social contract required it, but because something true had been said, and they had needed it. Said, and they recognized it in the specific way. You recognized a thing that had been true for a long time before you found the words for it. She stood at the podium and let it land. She didn't deflect, she didn't minimize. She had earned this, and she was not going to apologize for receiving it. Ada Ora was in the second row, beaming with the particular expression of someone who had known this was coming and had arranged to witness it. Patricia was beside her. Christopher had sent a text at 8 that morning that said only, "Call me after, proud of you." Her father had not attended. His health made the travel complicated. But her mother had, and Eleanor Ashworth was standing in the third row with the serene, unhurried expression of a woman who had always known her daughter was this. Marguerite stepped back from the podium. She thought about the Fairview Club dining room, about the toast, about the glass raised and the smile that had been so certain, and the room that had not answered it. She thought about the specific quality of that silence. Not hostile, not dramatic, just the natural result of a room reading a situation correctly and declining to validate a misreading of it. She thought about what Diane had not understood in that moment. Not about Marguerite. Diane had done her research on Marguerite. She had understood the charity boards, the public profile, the composed and careful public presence. What she had not understood was what that public presence was built on. She had researched the surface and had not looked beneath it, and beneath it was the family, and the work, and 19 years of building something real in a space that was entirely and completely her own. You couldn't toast against that. You could raise your glass and smile and believe with every cell in your body that you had arrived somewhere. And the room would watch, and the room would understand, and the room would be very quiet. Because power doesn't announce itself over champagne. Power builds, quietly, over years, until the building is so completely what it is that the announcement is beside the point. Diane Okafor had toasted her victory. She had aimed it at the wrong woman, and the wrong woman had walked out of the room and gone back to work. That was the whole story. That was the only story there had ever been.